If
I
you
can't
ever
do
had
this
to choose
anymore.
between saving everything you built, or finally feeling something real, what would you sacrifice?
I love you.
The ballroom shimmered like a dream carved from glass and gold, chandeliers casting soft light over silk gowns and tailored suits, 100 quiet conversations blending into a single elegant hum, but at the center of it all stood an empty space where a groom was supposed to be, the guests whispering, checking their watches, confusion slowly replacing celebration, and at the far end of the aisle, Emma Brooks stood alone in a simple ivory dress that didn't quite belong in a room like this, her fingers tightening around a bouquet she never asked for, her breath shallow, her heart not broken but, strangely calm, as if she had already seen this moment coming long before anyone else did, and somewhere high above the city, 6 months earlier, Alexander Hayes stared out from the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath him, sharp, powerful, untouchable. Just like the empire he was about to lose, the reflection staring back at him wasn't a man in control, it was a man cornered, tie loosened, jaw tight, eyes hollow from nights without sleep. The board wanted stability, the investors wanted reassurance, the press wanted a story, and what they all agreed on was simple: Alexander Hayes needed a wife, not for love, not for companionship, but for optics, for control, for survival, and he hated every second of it, until the night he met her. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't planned, it was just a quiet street outside a small community. Shelter where the city didn't bother pretending to be glamorous, rain falling in thin cold lines as Emma handed a warm cup of coffee to a man who looked like he had been invisible for years. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around to see if anyone noticed, she just smiled like it mattered, like he mattered, and Alexander, standing across the street under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: kindness that wasn't strategic, wasn't performative, wasn't asking for anything in return,
take this.
and that
It'll
was
help
rare,
keep you
that was
warm.
dangerous, that was exactly what he needed. The next day, Emma sat across from him in a quiet corner of a high-rise office she had no reason to be in, her worn coat folded neatly on her lap, her eyes steady despite the way her
think you'll
fingers
find this
curled slightly
favorable.
against the fabric. She didn't belong in his
While I
world,
appreciate
and
the
that was
offer,
precisely
I have a
why he chose her.
counter-proposition.
Alexander slid a document across the table, crisp, precise, clinical, a contract that reduced something sacred into bullet points and timelines, his voice even, controlled, almost detached as he said, "Marry me. 6 months. You'll be
Thank you
compensated,
all for joining us
protected,
tonight.
and free to walk away
Your
after.
support means
no emotion,
everything.
no
We
softness,
look forward to the future.
just an offer dressed like a solution." Emma
Help
blinked
yourself to
once,
as much as you like.
processing, not shocked
try
by the
this.
audacity but by the
Just
emptiness
ladle it
behind
out.
it. "You're serious,"
Like
she
this?
said quietly,
Perfect.
and Alexander nodded,
Help
leaning
yourself
back
to as much
slightly
as
as
you
if
need.
distance made it easier. "I don't need love. I need
Thank
stability.
you, I appreciate this.
You don't want anything from
We
me.
have to move now.
That makes you
Failure
perfect."
is not
and
an
there
option.
it was, the truth, simple and sharp. She wasn't chosen because she was special in his
path
world.
forward is
She was
clear.
chosen because
It
she
demands
existed
courage,
outside of it.
resolve,
Emma looked
and
down at the
absolute unity
contract.
from this
The
team.
numbers alone
I
could
know we
change
can do
everything
this.
for her. Overdue rent, medical
knew what
bills
this
for her
meant to
mother,
me.
the quiet fear that followed her every night. It
I
could
know,
all
and I'm
disappear,
sorry.
but something in her chest tightened,
I
not
can't
from
do this
temptation,
anymore.
but from the realization that this man had
I
built a life
know.
so big, so
I love
powerful,
you.
and yet, so empty. She
I'm
lifted her
sorry, I
gaze back
shouldn't
to
have
him,
done this.
searching for something human behind the polished
okay.
control. "And what
We can move
happens if
past
something
it.
real happens?" she asked,
I can't
her
do
voice
this
softer
anymore.
now, almost careful, and for the first
I
time,
know.
Alexander hesitated, just a fraction,
I love
just
you.
long enough to reveal the truth he never said out loud. "It won't," he replied, too quickly, too certain, as if repeating it made it true. Emma studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, not because she believed him, but because she understood something he didn't. Contracts can control behavior, but they can't control what grows in silence, and as she reached for the pen, the rain outside tapping gently against the glass, neither of them realized they had just signed something far more complicated than 6 months of pretending, because some agreements don't stay on paper, some promises rewrite themselves in the spaces between words, and sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a world built on control is a single act of kindness that refuses to be temporary. The first night in the penthouse did not feel like the beginning of a marriage. It felt like stepping into a place where everything had been carefully designed except for warmth. The space stretched wide and immaculate, glass walls framing the city lights like a painting that never changed, every surface polished, every detail intentional, yet somehow it felt untouched. like no one had ever truly lived there. Emma stood near the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, her small suitcase by her side, unsure if she was supposed to walk in or wait for permission, and when Alexander finally spoke, his voice echoed slightly in the open space. "You can make yourself comfortable." It sounded polite, but distant, like he was offering her access, not a home. Emma nodded quietly, stepping forward, her shoes soft against the marble floor, her eyes moving carefully across the room, taking everything in but not reacting. Because reacting would make it feel too real, and she was not sure she was ready for that yet. "Your room is upstairs," he added, already turning away as if the conversation had reached its limit. "There is staff if you need anything." And just like that, the man she had agreed to marry disappeared into another part of the penthouse, leaving behind silence that felt heavier than any argument could have been. The next morning began not with conversation, but with structure. A woman named Claire arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, her tablet in hand, her expression professional but curious, as if she had already formed an opinion and was now waiting to confirm it. "We have a full schedule today,"
While I
she
appreciate
said,
the offer,
glancing briefly
I have a
at Emma's simple
counterproposition.
outfit before continuing. "Fittings, etiquette coaching, media preparation." Emma blinked, trying to process how quickly her life had shifted from surviving day by day to being scheduled down to the minute. She followed without protest, because that was the agreement, because this was the role she had accepted,
Thank you all
and
for
because
joining
somewhere
us tonight.
deep down, she knew that
Your
saying no
support
now
means
would mean
everything.
going back to
We
a
look
life
forward to
where
the
no one
future.
was offering anything at all. Hours passed in a
yourself to
blur
as
of
much as you
fabrics,
like.
instructions,
I'll try this.
corrections, voices
Just
telling
ladle
her
it
how to
out.
sit, how to speak,
Like this?
how to smile
Perfect.
without revealing too much,
Help
how to
yourself
exist
to as
in a
much as
world
you
where
need.
every movement was watched. And through it all, Emma listened, she adapted.
Thank you, I appreciate
she
this.
learned,
We
not
have to
because she
move
wanted
now.
to impress anyone,
Failure
but
is not
because she
an
refused
option.
to be the reason someone looked down on her again. By late afternoon, she stood in front
The
of a
path
mirror
forward is
wearing a
clear.
dress that cost
It
more than
demands
everything she
courage,
owned combined.
resolve,
The
and
reflection
absolute
staring
unity from
back
this
at her
team.
looked almost like
I know
someone
we can
else,
do this.
polished, composed,
You knew
almost
what this
belonging,
meant to me.
but her eyes gave her away, still soft,
I
still
know,
real,
and I'm sorry.
still searching for something familiar in a
I
place
can't
that
do this
offered
anymore.
none. When she stepped into the main living
know.
area, Alexander was already there,
I love you.
reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up
sorry, I
briefly,
shouldn't have
his
done
gaze
this.
scanning her in a way that was not personal,
It's okay.
but evaluative,
We
as
can
if he
move
was
past
checking
it.
whether the investment had met expectations.
I can't do this
"It will
anymore."
work," he said simply, returning to his
I
screen,
know.
and for a second, Emma felt something
love
tighten in her
you.
chest, not anger, not sadness. Just a quiet understanding that in his world, she was still part of a plan, not a person. That night, their first public appearance arrived faster than she expected, a private dinner with investors, nothing extravagant by his standards, but everything about it felt like a test. The room was filled with people who spoke in measured tones and smiled without warmth, their eyes lingering just a little too long on Emma, assessing, questioning, judging. One woman leaned in slightly, her voice soft but sharp. "You must feel very lucky," and Emma met her gaze. Not defensive, not intimidated, just steady, "I think we both are," she replied, her voice calm, unexpected, and for the first time that evening, the conversation around them shifted, subtle, but noticeable. Alexander did not react immediately, but later, in the car ride back, the silence between them felt different, less empty, more aware. "You handled that well," he said finally, his tone quieter than usual. Emma looked out the window at the passing lights, her reflection faint against the glass. "I just told the truth," she answered, and he did not respond, but something in his expression changed, something small, almost invisible, like a crack forming in something that had been solid for far too long. Back at the penthouse, Emma moved instinctively toward the kitchen, opening cabinets, scanning shelves, not because she was told to, but because it felt like something she could control, something familiar. She found ingredients, simple ones, and began to cook, the movements natural, grounding, the quiet sound of utensils against pans filling the space in a way that felt alive. Alexander paused at the edge of the room, watching without announcing himself. He had not seen this before, not here, not in this space where everything was usually handled by someone else. "You do not have to do that," he said after a moment, and
Here,
Emma glanced
take
back
this.
briefly, a
It'll
small
help keep you
smile
warm.
touching her lips. "I know," she replied, turning back to what she was doing. "I just thought it might be nice," and for reasons he could not immediately explain. Alexander did not stop her, he stood there a little longer than necessary, listening to the quiet
think
rhythm
you'll
of
find this
something that had
favorable.
never existed in his life before, something
While I
simple,
appreciate the offer,
something unplanned,
I have a counter
something
proposition.
real. And as the city continued to move endlessly outside the glass walls, inside that silent penthouse, something almost imperceptible began to shift, not enough to change anything yet, not enough to break the rules they had agreed on, but enough to plant a question in a man who had always believed he already
Thank
had
you all
all
for
the
joining
answers.
us tonight.
By the end of the
Your
first
support
week,
means
the
everything.
penthouse no
We look
longer
forward
felt
to the
entirely
future.
untouched, not because anything
Help
dramatic
yourself
had
to as much as
changed,
you like.
but because small,
I'll try
quiet
this.
details began to
Just
exist
ladle
where
it
there had
out.
once been nothing, a folded
this?
blanket on the couch
Perfect.
that had never been used before,
Help
a
yourself
mug
to as
left
much as
near
you
the
need.
window instead of perfectly aligned in the cabinet, a faint scent of something
Thank you, I appreciate this.
warm lingering in the air long after
We
the
have to
kitchen
move
lights
now.
were turned off, and
Failure is
Alexander
not an
noticed
option.
all of it, not consciously at first, but in the way he paused half a second longer when walking
path
through the
forward is
living
clear.
space, in the way
It
his
demands
eyes
courage,
flicked toward things that
resolve,
had no
and
place in his
absolute unity
previous
from this
version of
team.
order,
I
things
know
that
we
should
can
have
do
felt
this.
like disruptions but somehow did
You
not.
knew what this meant
Emma
to me.
moved through the days with a kind of quiet consistency that did not
know,
demand
and I'm
attention
sorry.
but slowly earned it. She
I can't do
learned
this
the
anymore.
schedule, adapted to the expectations,
I
stood beside
know.
him at meetings and dinners without overstepping,
love you.
without shrinking either. She did exactly
sorry,
what the
I shouldn't have
contract
done
required,
this.
and yet somehow more, because
It's
she
okay.
never treated it like a
We can move
performance.
past it.
She treated it like real life, and
I
that
can't do
difference
this
was
anymore.
subtle but impossible to ignore. One afternoon,
know.
during a strategy meeting at the corporate office,
love you.
Alexander sat at the head of a long polished table, voices rising and falling around him. As executives debated projections and risks, numbers projected on a screen that seemed to matter more than anything else in the room, Emma sat quietly beside him, not expected to speak, not expected to understand, just present as part of the image he needed to maintain, until one of the senior partners made an offhand comment, something dismissive about a group of smaller vendors being cut from a contract. Calling them replaceable, the word hung in the air casually, but Emma's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, and before she could stop herself, she leaned forward just enough to speak, her voice calm but clear. Those vendors are families, not numbers. The room fell silent for a fraction of a second, surprised more by who said it than what was said. She did not sound emotional, she sounded certain. If you replace them, you might save money now, but you lose trust. And trust is harder to rebuild than profit. Alexander did not interrupt her, even though every instinct trained him to maintain control in moments like this. Instead, he watched, studying not just her words, but the way she said them, grounded, unafraid, not trying to impress anyone, just stating something she believed was true, and for reasons he could not immediately define. He did not shut the conversation down, he let it continue, and something shifted again, subtle, but real. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered on beneath them, Alexander stood alone in his office, looking at the same skyline he had stared at countless times before, except now, his mind was not entirely occupied by numbers and strategy. There was a question lingering, quiet but persistent, when Emma stepped into the room. She hesitated slightly, noticing the tension in his posture. "Long day?" she asked softly, not out of obligation, but genuine observation. He exhaled slowly, a sound
Here,
that felt
take
heavier than
this.
usual. "They
It'll
think
help
cutting
keep you
people is
warm."
efficiency," he said, almost to himself. Emma walked a little closer, not too close, just enough to be present without intruding. "Sometimes it is," she replied honestly. Then after a small pause, "but sometimes it just means you
I think
forgot
you'll
why
find
you
this
started."
favorable.
He turned his head
While
slightly,
I appreciate
looking
the
at her
offer,
more directly
I have a
now,
counter
really
proposition.
looking, as if trying to understand how someone who had so little could speak with such clarity about something he had built his entire life around. "And what do you think I forgot?" he asked, not defensive, just curious in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "That people are not part of the
Thank you
system,"
all for joining
she
us
said
tonight.
quietly. "They are the
Your
reason the
support
system
means
exists."
everything.
The
We
words
look
did
forward
not
to the
come
future.
with accusation,
Help
just
yourself
truth,
to as much as
and
you
for
like.
a moment, neither of
I'll
them
try
spoke.
this.
The silence
Just
between
ladle
them
it
no
out.
longer empty, but filled with
this?
something neither of them had
Perfect.
planned for. Later that
Help
night,
yourself to
as
as much
Emma
as you
moved
need.
through the kitchen again, preparing something simple, something familiar,
Thank you, I
Alexander
appreciate
found
this.
himself sitting at the counter instead
We
of
have to
retreating
move
to his
now.
office, watching
Failure
without
is not an
announcing his
option.
presence right away. "You do that every night," he said after a while, his voice
The path
softer than
forward is
usual.
clear.
Emma
It demands courage,
glanced over
resolve,
briefly,
and
a small
absolute
smile
unity from
touching
this
her
team.
lips. "It helps
I know
me
we can
think,"
do this.
she answered, stirring slowly,
knew what this
"and
meant
it
to
makes a
me.
place feel less temporary." He frowned slightly at that,
I know,
the
and
word
I'm
lingering
sorry.
longer than it Should
I
have,
can't do this
temporary,
anymore.
he repeated under his breath, as if testing
know.
it, as if realizing that was exactly
I
how he
love
had designed
you.
everything in his life, controlled,
I'm sorry, I
efficient,
shouldn't have
and
done
always
this.
temporary when it came to anything that
It's
resembled
okay.
feeling. Emma turned
can
off
move
the
past
stove
it.
and set the plate in front of him without
I
ceremony,
can't do this anymore.
without expectation, just an offering. You
I
should
know.
eat, she said simply, and for a moment.
I love
He did
you.
not move, not because he did not want to, but because something about the simplicity of it unsettled him in a way he was not used to. No contracts, no conditions, no benefit attached, just something given because she chose to give it, and as he finally reached for the fork, something shifted again, deeper this time, not visible, not dramatic, but undeniable, because for the first time in a long time, Alexander Hayes was not thinking about what he was gaining or losing. He was thinking about what he was starting to feel, and that was something no contract had ever prepared him for. The shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded in quiet moments that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both of them began to notice. Alexander started coming home earlier without explaining why, his meetings ending just a little sooner, his nights no longer stretching endlessly into silence, and each time he stepped into the penthouse, there was a subtle pause, like he was expecting something now. Something that had not existed before. Sometimes it was the soft light in the kitchen. Sometimes it was the quiet sound of movement. Sometimes it was simply the feeling that the space was no longer empty. Emma never pointed it out, she did not ask questions, she just continued being exactly who she was, consistent, steady, unassuming, and somehow that made everything feel more real than anything he had carefully constructed in his life before. One evening, as rain traced slow lines against the glass walls, the city below glowing in blurred reflections, Emma stood by the window. With her arms folded loosely, watching the storm with a calm that did not match the tension in the room behind her. Alexander had just ended a call, his voice controlled but tight, the kind of conversation that did not need to be loud to carry weight. He placed his phone down with more force than necessary, running a hand through his hair as if trying to clear something he could not quite name. Emma turned slightly, her voice soft but grounded. Another problem, she
Here,
asked,
take this.
not intruding,
It'll
just
help keep
present.
you warm.
He let out a breath, longer this time. They want me to sign off on a restructuring plan, he said, his tone flat. It will stabilize things quickly. There was a pause before he added, almost reluctantly, it also means cutting hundreds
you'll
of
find this
jobs.
favorable.
Emma did not respond immediately, she just
While I
listened,
appreciate the
way
offer,
she always
I have a
did,
counter
without
proposition.
rushing to fill the silence. And what do you think? She asked after a moment, and the question landed differently than the ones he was used to, because it was not about strategy, it was not about numbers, it was about him. Alexander walked closer to the window, standing beside her but not quite looking at her. I think it
Thank
is
you
the
all for
logical
joining us
choice,
tonight.
he
Your
said,
support
but
means
there was
everything.
something missing in the
We
way
look
he
forward
said
to
it,
the future.
something that sounded more like repetition than
Help
belief.
yourself to as
Emma
much as you
nodded
like.
slightly, her
I'll
gaze
try
still on the
this.
rain. Logical
Just
does not
ladle it
always
out.
mean right, she said
Like this?
quietly, not as a
Perfect.
challenge, just as a statement.
yourself
He
to
turned
as
his
much
head
as you
then,
need.
studying her expression, trying to understand how she could say something
Thank
so
you, I
simple
appreciate
and
this.
yet make it feel complicated.
We
And
have to
what would
move
you
now.
do? He asked.
Failure
And
is
this
not an
time there was
option.
no distance in his voice, just curiosity. Emma thought
The
for a
path forward
second,
is clear.
not because she needed
It
time,
demands
but
courage,
because she respected the
resolve,
weight
and
of the
absolute
question.
unity
I would
from this
find
team.
another way,
I
she
know we
said
can do
finally,
this.
even if it takes longer,
You
even
knew
if
what
it is
this meant
harder,
to me.
because once you start choosing what is easy over what is right,
know,
it
and I'm
becomes a habit.
sorry.
Her words settled into the room,
I can't do
quiet
this
but
anymore.
undeniable, and Alexander did not argue.
I know.
He did not dismiss it. He just stood there,
love you.
absorbing something he had spent years avoiding.
I'm sorry,
Later
I
that
shouldn't
night,
have done this.
instead of retreating to separate
okay.
spaces, they remained in the
move
living
past it.
area, the distance between them no longer
can't do
defined
this
by
anymore.
obligation, but by something unspoken that neither of them had
know.
agreed to. Emma
I
curled
love you.
slightly into the corner of the couch, a book resting in her hands, the soft rustle of pages filling the silence. Alexander sat across from her at first, his laptop open, but his focus drifting, his eyes lifting more often than they should, drawn not to what she was doing, but to the quiet way she existed, unbothered by the expectations that ruled his entire world. After a while, he closed the laptop without realizing it, the screen fading to black as he leaned back slightly. You make this place feel different, he said suddenly, the words slipping out before he could filter them. Emma looked up, surprised not by what he said, but by the fact that he said it at all. Different how? She asked gently, and he hesitated, searching for something precise in a feeling that was anything but less empty. He admitted, the word carrying more weight than he intended. Emma held his gaze for a moment, then smiled softly. Not triumphant, not emotional, just understanding. It was never. The place that was empty, she said, returning her attention to the page, leaving the rest unsaid, and somehow that unfinished sentence stayed with him longer than any complete explanation ever could. Days later, during another high-profile event, the kind filled with cameras and controlled conversations, something small but telling happened. A waiter stumbled slightly while carrying a tray, the room barely noticing except for a few dismissive glances, but Emma stepped forward instinctively. Steadying the tray, offering a quiet word of reassurance, treating the moment like it mattered even when no one else thought it did. Alexander saw it from across the room, and this time, he did not look away. He watched fully, openly, recognizing something that had been in front of him all along, something that could not be written into contracts or predicted in boardrooms, something that did not need permission to exist. And as the evening continued, as conversations flowed and appearances were maintained, one realization settled in slowly, almost quietly, but impossible to ignore.
It'll help keep you
He had
warm.
chosen her because she did not belong to his world, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to question whether his world had ever been complete without someone like her in it. The illusion of control began to fracture on a morning that looked no different from any other. Sunlight spilling across the glass
While I
walls,
appreciate
the city
offer,
moving in its
I have a
usual rhythm below,
counter-proposition.
but inside the penthouse, something subtle had shifted long before either of them fully recognized it. Emma stood at the kitchen counter, carefully wrapping a small container of food, her movements calm and intentional. While Alexander watched from a distance he no longer seemed comfortable maintaining. You are
Thank you all for
leaving
joining
early,
us tonight.
he said, his voice
Your
carrying a
support
question
means
he did not
everything.
directly
We look
ask.
forward to the
Emma
future.
nodded, placing the container into her bag.
Help yourself
There
to
is
as
a
much as
shelter
you like.
downtown, she
try
explained.
this.
They serve breakfast
Just
to people
ladle
who
it
do
out.
not have anywhere else to go.
Like this?
I used to help when I
Perfect.
could. She paused
Help
briefly
yourself
before
to as
adding,
much as you
I
need.
thought I would go again. Alexander frowned slightly, not in disapproval,
Thank you, I
but in
appreciate this.
unfamiliarity. You do not have
have
to
to
do that
move now.
anymore, he said,
Failure
the
is
words
not an
instinctive,
option.
shaped by a world where problems were solved by removing necessity.
The path forward
Emma
is
looked
clear.
at him then,
It
her
demands
expression
courage,
gentle but firm.
resolve,
I know,
and absolute
she said
unity
softly,
from this team.
that is not why
I know
I
we
do
can
it.
do this.
And for a moment, he did not
You knew
respond,
what this meant to
because
me.
there was no immediate logic to counter what she had just said,
I know,
only
and
something
I'm
deeper
sorry.
that he had not yet learned how to articulate.
I can't do
Later
this
that
anymore.
day, in a boardroom filled with polished confidence and
know.
carefully chosen words, the tension
I
that had
love
been building
you.
beneath the surface finally began.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have
To
done
show
this.
itself, the restructuring plan was
It's
back
okay.
on the table, presented
We can move
again with
past it.
numbers that made sense, projections
I
that
can't do
promised
this
stability,
anymore.
and arguments that left little room for hesitation.
know.
Alexander listened, but this time,
I love
something
you.
felt different, not in the data, not in the strategy, but in the quiet echo of a voice that was not in the room, a voice that reminded him that numbers did not tell the whole story. We need a decision, one of the senior partners said, breaking through the silence, and all eyes turned toward him, waiting for the same response they had expected from him every time before, the logical choice, the efficient choice, the choice that protected the company above all else. Alexander leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but his mind no longer moving along the same predictable path. Give me 48 hours, he said finally, his voice steady but different. The room reacted with surprise, subtle but unmistakable, because hesitation was not something he had ever allowed himself before. That evening, when he returned to the penthouse, the space felt quieter than usual, not empty, but missing something he had started to rely on without realizing it. Emma had not come back yet, and for the first time, the absence felt noticeable, not as a disruption, but as something incomplete. He moved through the room slowly, pausing near the kitchen where a faint trace of warmth still lingered, a reminder of something simple that had begun to matter more than he expected. Hours later, the door finally opened, and Emma stepped inside, her shoulders slightly tired. Her hands carrying nothing but the quiet presence she always brought with her. She noticed him immediately, standing there as if he had been waiting, even if he would not admit it. Long day? She asked softly, echoing a question she had asked before, but this time it carried something different, something shared. Alexander nodded once, then after a brief pause, I did not sign it, he said, the words simple but heavy with implication. Emma studied him for a moment, not reacting right away, not offering praise or surprise, just listening. The plan, he clarified, as if he needed to make sure she understood, I ask for more time. Emma's lips
Here,
curved
take
slightly,
this.
not into a
It'll
full
help keep
smile,
you warm.
but into something quieter, something that acknowledged the weight of what he had just done. That means you are thinking, she said gently, and he let out a small breath, something close to a laugh but not quite. That is what concerns me, he admitted. And for a moment,
you'll
the
find this
tension
favorable.
between them softened into something
I
almost
appreciate
like,
the offer,
later that
I
night,
have a
as the city
counter-proposition.
dimmed and the world outside slowed, they found themselves sitting closer than before, not by design, but by choice that neither of them had. Spoken out loud, Emma rested her arms loosely around her knees, her gaze distant but peaceful, while Alexander sat beside her, the usual barriers
Thank you all
between
for
them no
joining us
longer as
tonight.
rigid. Why do you keep
Your
choosing
support
people?
means everything.
He asked suddenly,
We look forward
the
to the
question
future.
coming from a place deeper than curiosity.
Help yourself
Emma
to as
turned
much
her
as
head
you like.
slightly, considering
I'll try this.
because someone once
Just
chose
ladle
me,
it out.
she answered, her
Like
voice
this?
quiet,
Perfect.
almost reflective. When I
Help
had
yourself
nothing,
to as
when it
much
did
as you
not make
need.
sense, someone still believed I mattered.
Thank
She
you, I
paused,
appreciate this.
her eyes softening with the memory
We have to
that
move
changes
now.
you. Alexander
Failure is
absorbed
not an
her words
option.
slowly, feeling something shift again, not externally, not visibly, but
The path
internally,
forward is
in
clear.
a place he had kept
It
carefully
demands
guarded for
courage,
years.
resolve,
And for the
and
first
absolute
time,
unity
the
from this
decision
team.
in front of him was
I know
no
we can
longer
do
just
this.
about saving a company. It
You
was
knew
about
what this meant
deciding
to
what
me.
kind of man he wanted to be when there was nothing left to hide behind.
know, and I'm
as the
sorry.
silence settled between them once more,
I can't
it was
do
no
this anymore.
longer empty. It was filled with something
know.
fragile, something growing, something
I
neither
love
of them
you.
had planned for but neither of them could
I'm
ignore
sorry,
anymore.
I shouldn't have done this.
The 48 hours he asked for did
It's
not
okay.
feel like time.
We can
They
move
felt like
past it.
pressure building in a space that had never
I
allowed
can't do this
uncertainty to
anymore.
exist. Every call he ignored, every
I
message he
know.
postponed, every expectation waiting on
love
the other
you.
side of his decision pressed quietly against him, and yet for the first time in years, Alexander did not rush to silence it. He let the tension sit, he let the question remain unanswered. And that alone began to change something fundamental in the way he moved through his own world. The next morning, instead of heading straight into meetings, he found himself standing outside a modest building downtown, the kind of place he would have driven past 100 times without noticing, except now he did notice, because he knew she was inside, because he wanted to understand something he had only seen from a distance. Inside, the shelter was simple, clean but worn, filled with quiet movement and soft conversations, people moving through routines that were not about efficiency, but about care. And there, among them, Emma moved with the same quiet confidence she carried everywhere else, greeting people by name, offering small smiles, handing out plates of food as if each one mattered, because to her, they did. Alexander stood near the entrance longer than necessary, unsure of where to place himself in a world that did not operate on status or control, and when Emma finally noticed him, her expression did not shift into surprise or concern, it softened, just slightly, like she had expected him to show up even if he had not realized it himself. You came, she said simply, walking over with calm steps, and he nodded once, glancing around as if trying to make sense of something that did not fit into any structure he knew. I wanted to see, he admitted, and she studied him for a moment, then gestured lightly toward the room. Then stay, she said, not as an invitation, but as a quiet acceptance, and so he did. Awkward at first, uncertain, but present. He watched, he listened, he observed the way people responded to her, not because of what she had, but because of who she was, and slowly, almost without realizing it, he began to participate, handing out plates,
Here,
refilling
take
cups,
this.
offering small
It'll help
nods to
keep you
people who
warm.
did not recognize him and did not need to, and for the first time in a long time, he was not being evaluated, not being expected to perform, he was simply there. Later, as the morning settled into a quieter rhythm, Emma stood beside him near
I
the
think you'll
back of
find
the
this
room.
favorable.
Her hands resting loosely
While I
against the
appreciate
edge
the
of a
offer,
table.
I
What
have
do
a
you think?
counter-proposition.
She asked, her voice low enough to match the calm around them. Alexander looked across the room, taking in the details he would have missed before, the worn chairs, the quiet gratitude in people's expressions, the way something so simple could hold so much meaning. I think, he said slowly, choosing his words more
Thank you
carefully
all for
than
joining
usual.
us tonight.
I have been measuring success
Your
wrong.
support means
Emma did not
everything.
respond
We
right
look
away.
forward to the
She
future.
just watched him,
Help
as if
yourself to
letting
as
him
much
reach
as you
the rest
like.
on his own,
I'll
and
try
after a
this.
moment, he did.
Just ladle it
I built
out.
something that works,
Like
he
this?
continued, but I do
Perfect.
not know if it matters.
Help
The
yourself
admission
to
hung
as much
between
as you
them,
need.
quiet but significant, and Emma's expression
Thank you,
softened
I
further,
appreciate this.
not in pity, but in understanding.
to move
Then
now.
maybe this is your chance
Failure
to
is
change
not
that,
an option.
she said gently, not pushing, just offering, and for once, he did not resist
path
the
forward
idea.
is clear.
He did not analyze it
demands
or reduce
courage,
it to strategy.
resolve,
He
and
simply
absolute
considered
unity
it.
from this
That
team.
afternoon,
I
when
know we can do
Alexander
this.
returned to the corporate office, the
You knew
building
what this
felt
meant to me.
different. Not because anything had changed, but because he
I know,
had
and
the
I'm
same
sorry.
polished floors, the same control.
I can't do this anymore.
Environment, the same expectations waiting for
I
him,
know.
but now there was something else layered beneath
I
it.
love you.
Something that made everything feel less certain
I'm
and
sorry,
more
I
important
shouldn't
at the
have done
same
this.
time. The boardroom filled again,
It's
the same
okay.
faces, the
We can
same
move past
pressure,
it.
but when the conversation returned to the
I can't do
restructuring
this
plan,
anymore.
Alexander did not respond the way they expected.
know.
He listened, fully, then leaned
I love
forward
you.
slightly. His voice calm but unmistakably firm. "We are not cutting them," he said, and the reaction was immediate: questions, concerns, resistance, all rising at once, but this time, he did not retreat behind logic alone. He met each argument with something more balanced, something that acknowledged both the numbers and the people behind them. "We will find another way," he repeated, echoing words that had once come from someone standing quietly beside him, and for the first time, the decision was not just strategic, it was personal. That night, back at the penthouse, the silence felt different again, not heavy, not uncertain, but full, as if something had settled into place that had been waiting far longer than either of them realized. Emma stood near the window, looking out at the city that never truly slowed, and when Alexander stepped beside her, the distance between them felt smaller than ever before, not because of proximity, but because of understanding. "I made the decision," he said quietly. And she turned slightly, meeting his gaze with calm expectation. "I no," she replied, and he paused, just long enough to let the moment hold its weight. "I did not do it for the company," he added, his voice lower now, more honest than it had ever been. "I did it because it felt right." Emma's expression softened into something warmer, something that carried quiet pride without needing to say it out loud, and as the city lights flickered in the reflection around them, something deeper than obligation, deeper than agreement, settled into the space they shared, something that no contract could define, something that was no longer temporary, even if neither of them had found the words to say it yet. The fallout did not begin with an explosion, it began with a whisper that spread faster than anything Alexander could control. A single article published just after sunrise, a headline carefully crafted to sound like concern but designed to provoke doubt, questioning the sudden marriage, the timing, the decision to halt the restructuring
take
plan,
this.
and within hours,
It'll help keep
the
you
narrative
warm.
shifted from speculation to accusation. Investors began calling, board members demanded answers, and the calm control Alexander had maintained for years started to feel fragile under the weight of something he could not immediately contain.
I
By
think you'll find this
mid-morning, the
favorable.
conference room was filled again, but this time
While
the
I appreciate
atmosphere
the
was
offer,
sharper, less
I have a
polished, more
counter-proposition.
urgent. "We need transparency," one of the senior partners insisted, his tone no longer measured. "This marriage, this delay, it all looks calculated." The word lingered, heavier than the rest. And Alexander sat at the head of the table, listening, not reacting immediately.
Thank you all for
but the
joining
pressure
us
was
tonight.
different now, not just
Your
about
support
numbers,
means
but
everything.
about perception,
We look forward
about
to the
trust
future.
slipping through something he had never expected to
Help
question.
yourself to as
"It
much
is a
as you
strategic
like."
decision," he
I'll try
replied
this.
finally, his
Just
voice
ladle
steady,
it out.
but even as he said it,
Like
he
this?
felt the weight of the
Perfect.
words, because they were no longer
yourself
entirely
to as
true,
much as you
and
need.
that was something he could not ignore anymore. Outside the building, the
Thank you,
story
I
had
appreciate
already
this.
reached Emma before he could find a
We
way
have
to
to move
explain it.
now. Failure
Himself,
is not an
she
option.
stood just inside the entrance of the shelter, her phone still in her hand, the screen dimming
path
as the
forward is
article
clear.
replayed in her mind.
It demands
the phrases,
courage,
the
resolve,
tone, the
and
implication
absolute
that
unity from
everything
this
about their
team.
marriage had been
I know
nothing
we can
more
do
than a
this.
calculated move, something
You
arranged.
knew what this meant to me.
Something designed, something, not real,
know,
and the
and I'm
quiet
sorry.
understanding she had carried until now began
I
to
can't
shift
do this
into something
anymore.
else, something heavier, something that made
I
her chest
know.
tighten in a way she had not expected.
I
She
love
did not
you.
leave immediately, she finished what
I'm
she had
sorry,
started,
I shouldn't have
helping
done
where
this.
she could, moving through the motions with
It's
the
okay.
same calm presence.
We can move
but the
past
warmth
it.
that usually guided her actions felt
I
distant,
can't do this anymore.
replaced by questions she had never asked out loud.
I know.
Later that evening, when Alexander
love
returned
you.
to the penthouse, the silence was not the same as before. It was no longer filled with quiet understanding, it was filled with something uncertain, something waiting. Emma stood near the window again, her posture composed, but her eyes no longer soft. She turned as he stepped inside, and for the first time, the distance between them felt deliberate. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice calm, but lacking the gentle warmth it once held. Alexander paused, just long enough for the hesitation to matter, and that was all it took. The article, she clarified, lifting her phone slightly, that this marriage was part of a strategy to stabilize your company. The words were not accusatory, but they carried weight, and Alexander exhaled slowly, knowing there was no version of the truth that would not change something between them. It started that way, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Stripped of the control he usually maintained, Emma nodded once, absorbing the answer. Without interrupting, and everything else, she asked, her gaze steady, searching for something he had not yet said. Alexander took a step closer, but stopped, as if unsure of how close he was allowed to be anymore. That changed, he said, and for a moment, the room held still, the words hanging between them, uncertain, fragile. Emma looked at him for a long second, then another, as if measuring something she could not quite define. When? She asked softly, and this time, he did not have an immediate answer, because there was no single moment he could point to, no clear line where everything shifted, just a series of quiet changes that had built into something he had not planned for, and the silence that followed said more than any explanation could have. Emma's expression did not break, she did not raise her voice, she did not turn away immediately, but something in her posture changed, something subtle but final. I knew there was a contract, she said slowly. I agreed to that. She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone in her hand.
It'll help keep you warm.
But I did not agree to being chosen because I fit a plan. The words were not loud, but they landed with more weight than anything else she had said before. Alexander felt it, not as an argument, but as something deeper, something he could not defend against with logic or explanation. You were not just a plan,
While I
he
appreciate
said,
the
the
offer,
words coming quickly
I have a
now,
counterproposition.
but they felt incomplete even as he said them. Emma shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet understanding. Maybe not anymore, she said, but that is how it started. And that truth, simple and undeniable, settled between them like something neither of them could move past easily.
Thank you all
She
for
stepped
joining
back
us
then,
tonight.
creating space where there
Your
had once
support
been
means
none.
everything.
I need time,
We look forward
she
to the
added,
future.
her voice softer now, not cold,
yourself to
but
as much as
distant
you
in a way
like.
that hurt more than
I'll
anger
try
ever
this.
could. And for
Just
the first
ladle it
time
out.
since all of this began,
Like this?
Alexander did not know
Perfect.
how to respond, not
Help
because he did
yourself
not
to as
want
much
to,
as you need.
but because he finally understood that this was not something he could fix with decisions
Thank
or
you, I
control.
appreciate this.
This was something he had to face
We
without
have to
either.
move now.
And as
Failure
Emma
is
turned
not an
away,
option.
the quiet sound of her footsteps moving toward the other room echoing slightly in the space that
The
had
path
once
forward
felt
is
less
clear.
empty. Alexander
It demands
stood there,
courage,
still,
resolve,
the
and
realization
absolute
settling in
unity from this
slowly
team.
but completely,
I know
that
we
the
can
one
do
thing
this.
he had not planned for, the
You knew
one
what
thing
this
he had
meant to
not
me.
calculated, was the only thing that now mattered.
I
And for the
know,
first
and I'm
time,
sorry.
losing it felt like something he could not afford.
can't do this
no matter
anymore.
what it cost him. The next morning did not
know.
come with clarity, it came with distance,
love you.
quiet and deliberate, the kind that
I'm
settles
sorry,
in
I
slowly
shouldn't have
but
done
changes
this.
everything once it is there. Emma moved
okay.
through the penthouse like a
We can
guest
move
again,
past it.
her presence careful, her steps
I
lighter.
can't do this
as
anymore.
if she was already preparing
I
to leave
know.
even though she had not said it out loud,
I
and
love
Alexander
you.
felt it in every silence, in every glance that did not linger, in every word that stayed unspoken. He tried to approach her more than once, starting sentences that never fully formed, because for the first time, he understood that this was not something he could resolve with logic or reassurance. This was about trust. And trust was not something he had ever learned how to rebuild. By mid-morning, the calls had not stopped, the board demanded a public response, the media had turned curiosity into pressure, and the narrative was slipping further away from him with every hour he waited. Claire stood in his office, her usual composure strained just enough to reveal urgency. We need to control the story, she said, placing a tablet in front of him, headlines scrolling faster than they could be contained. If we do not address this now, it will define everything moving forward. Alexander looked at the screen, but the words felt distant compared to the one conversation that had stayed with him all night, the one he could not replay differently no matter how many times he tried. Schedule a press conference, he said finally, his voice calm but resolved in a way Claire had not heard before. She blinked slightly, surprised by the immediacy. You are going to respond publicly, she asked, and he nodded once, not elaborating. Because this decision was not about strategy anymore, it was about something he had avoided for too long, honesty. Hours later, the room filled with cameras and controlled anticipation, the air thick with expectation as reporters waited for the version of Alexander Hayes they were used to, composed, precise, untouchable. But when he stepped onto the stage, something was different, not in his posture, not in his presence, but in the absence of the distance he had always maintained. He did not begin with numbers, he did not begin with defense, he began with truth. The reports about my marriage are partially correct, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the room without needing to rise. The immediate shift in
Here,
attention was
take
palpable,
this.
every camera
It'll help keep you warm.
focused, every question held back for just a moment longer. This arrangement started as a decision tied to my company, he continued, not avoiding the words, not softening them. I made that choice. A murmur moved through the room, subtle but
I think you'll
undeniable,
find this
but he did
favorable.
not stop there. He did not retreat into
While I appreciate
explanation
the
or
offer,
justification.
I have a
Instead,
counterproposition.
he took a breath, something small but significant, and continued. What those reports do not understand is that people are not strategies. His gaze remained forward, unwavering, and somewhere along the way, I realized that I stopped seeing someone as part of a plan, and started seeing her
Thank
as
you all
someone who
for
mattered.
joining us
The
tonight.
words landed differently than
Your
anything he
support
had
means
said before,
everything.
not
We look
polished,
forward to the
not
future.
calculated, just real, and that alone
yourself to
shifted
as
the
much
tone
as
of
you
the
like.
room. Questions
I'll try
followed
this.
immediately, sharper
Just
now,
ladle it out.
pressing, demanding clarity,
this?
but Alexander
Perfect.
did not retreat. He
Help
answered what
yourself
he
to as
could,
much as you
and when
need.
he could not, he did not hide behind deflection.
Thank you,
He
I
stood
appreciate
there
this.
and accepted the uncertainty that
We
came
have to
with
move
telling the
now.
truth. Back at
Failure
the
is
penthouse,
not an
Emma
option.
watched the broadcast in silence, standing near the same window where so many quiet moments
path
had
forward is
unfolded.
clear.
Her arms
It
folded
demands
loosely,
courage,
her expression
resolve, and
unreadable at
absolute
first,
unity from
but
this
as his
team.
words continued,
I know we can do
something
this.
shifted, not completely,
You knew
not
what this
instantly,
meant to me.
but enough to break through the wall she had built since the night before.
know, and I'm
because what she
sorry.
heard was not a perfect apology,
I can't
not
do
a
this anymore.
carefully crafted message. It was
I
something
know.
unfamiliar coming from him, vulnerability,
I love
and that
you.
was something she had not expected him to
I'm
show,
sorry, I shouldn't have
especially
done
not
this.
to the world. When the broadcast ended,
It's okay.
the silence returned,
We can move
but it
past
felt
it.
different now, not resolved,
I
not
can't do
healed,
this
but
anymore.
open in a way it had not been before. Hours
I
passed
know.
before the door opened, and when Alexander
I love
stepped
you.
inside, he did not speak immediately. He did not try to explain or defend, he simply stood there, giving her space to respond in her own time. Emma turned slowly, meeting his gaze with something that was no longer just hurt, but something more complicated, something that held both doubt and recognition at the same time. You did not have to do that, she said quietly, and he shook his head once, the movement small but certain. Yes, I did, he replied, his voice steady but softer than before. Not for the company, he added, taking a step closer, careful not to close the distance too quickly. For you. The words hung between them, not demanding acceptance, not expecting forgiveness, just offered. Emma looked at him for a long moment, searching for something she had not been sure existed before, something that could not be written into contracts or proven with decisions, and she saw it, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make her pause, enough to keep her from turning away. I still need time, she said finally, her voice quieter now, less guarded but still uncertain, and Alexander nodded, not arguing, not pushing, because this time, he understood that some things could not be rushed. I know, he said. And for the first time since everything began to unravel, the silence that followed was not filled with distance, it was filled with possibility, fragile and uncertain, but real enough to matter. The day of the wedding returned, but this time it did not feel like a performance, it felt like a question waiting to be answered. The same ballroom stood ready, the same golden light reflecting off polished floors, the same quiet hum of anticipation filling the air, but something fundamental had changed. The whispers were softer now, less curious, more watchful, because this time, no one knew what would happen, and that uncertainty carried more weight than any carefully planned event ever could. At the end of the aisle, Alexander stood alone,
take
not
this.
distant, not
It'll help
untouchable,
keep you warm.
just present, his posture steady but no longer guarded, his gaze fixed forward not because he had to maintain control, but because for the first time, he was waiting, not for an outcome, but for a choice that was no longer his to make. The contract that had
I
once
think you'll find
defined
this
everything lay
favorable.
folded in his pocket, untouched,
While I
unnecessary.
appreciate the offer,
A reminder
I
of
have a
something he no longer
counterproposition.
believed in. Minutes passed slowly, each second stretching just enough to make the silence noticeable. The doors at the back of the room remained closed. And for a moment, it would have been easy to assume the story had already ended, that the distance between them had grown too wide to cross,
Thank you all
that
for
some
joining
things,
us tonight.
once broken, could not be
Your
rebuilt.
support means
But
everything.
then, quietly,
We look forward to
without
the future.
announcement, the doors opened, and Emma
Help
stepped
yourself to as
inside,
much as you like.
not rushed, not
I'll try this.
uncertain, just calm,
Just ladle
her
it
presence
out.
steady in a way that carried
this?
more meaning than any
Perfect.
dramatic entrance ever could.
Help
She
yourself
was
to
not
as much
dressed
as
for
you need.
spectacle, she was dressed for truth, simple, elegant, real,
Thank you, I
and
appreciate this.
as she began to
We
walk
have to move
forward,
now.
the room shifted,
Failure
not
is
in
not an
sound,
option.
but in feeling, because this was no longer about appearance, it was about intention.
The path forward
Alexander
is
did
clear.
not move.
It
He did
demands
not step
courage,
toward her.
resolve,
He let her
and
come at her own
absolute unity
pace,
from this team.
because this time,
I know
he
we can do
understood
this.
that the distance between them was not
You knew
something
what
he
this
could
meant to
close
me.
for her. It was something she had to choose to cross. When
I
she
know,
finally
and I'm
reached
sorry.
him, she did not speak immediately.
I can't
she
do
simply
this
looked at
anymore.
him, searching not for perfection,
I know.
not for certainty, but for honesty.
I love
and what she
you.
saw was not the man who had once
I'm
offered her
sorry,
a
I
contract,
shouldn't have done
but
this.
someone who had learned what it meant to stand without
It's
one.
okay.
You are still here,
We can move
she
past
said
it.
softly, and there was a trace of something
can't
lighter
do
in her
this
voice,
anymore.
something that had not been there before. Alexander
know.
let out a small breath, almost a quiet
love
acknowledgement
you.
of everything that had brought them to this moment. I told you I would not leave, he replied, and this time, it was not a statement of control, it was a promise, simple and unguarded. Emma glanced down briefly, then back up, her expression thoughtful. The contract, she said, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded paper that had once defined the boundaries of their entire relationship. He looked at it for a moment, not with regret, but with understanding, then without hesitation, he tore it in half, then again. The sound quiet but final, letting the pieces fall without ceremony, that was never the part that mattered, he said, his voice steady, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any grand declaration ever could. Emma watched him, not surprised by the action, but by the meaning behind it, by the fact that he no longer needed something written to prove something real. And now, she asked, the question soft but significant, and Alexander met her gaze fully, no hesitation, no distance left between what he felt and what he was willing to say. Now, I am asking you to stay, he said, not because of an agreement, not because it solves anything, but because I choose you. The words settled into the space between them. Not demanding, not expecting, just offered. Emma felt it, the difference, the absence of pressure, the presence of something genuine, and for a moment, she allowed herself to consider not what had been, but
Here,
what could be,
take this.
the uncertainty,
It'll help
the
keep
risk,
you warm.
the possibility that something real could exist where something planned once stood, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her expression softened, not into certainty, but into acceptance. Then I will stay, she said quietly. And there was no need
think
for
you'll find
anything
this
louder,
favorable.
because the meaning behind those words carried
While I appreciate the offer,
everything that
I have a
mattered.
counter
The room
proposition.
seemed to exhale around them, the tension dissolving into something lighter, something warmer, but neither of them looked away, because this moment was not about the people watching, it was about the choice they had both made without guarantees, without conditions, just trust. Later, as the ceremony unfolded, simple,
Thank you all for joining
unforced,
us tonight.
free from the expectations that
Your
had once
support means
surrounded it.
everything.
The world
We look
outside
forward to the
continued to
future.
move as it always had. The company
Help
would
yourself
recover.
to as much as you like.
Not because of
I'll try
strategy
this.
alone, but because
Just
of
ladle it
decisions
out.
made with something more than logic,
this?
and inside the
Perfect.
quiet space they had created
Help
together,
yourself to as
something
much as you
stronger than
need.
any contract had taken its place, something that could not be written, could
Thank
not
you,
be
I appreciate
controlled,
this.
but could be chosen again and again.
We have to move
And
now.
as the final words were
Failure is
spoken,
not an
not as
option.
an obligation, but as a promise, Alexander understood something he had never allowed
path
himself
forward
to
is
believe
clear.
before,
It
that
demands
success was
courage,
not measured
resolve,
by what
and absolute unity
you built
from this
alone,
team.
but by what
I
you
know
were
we can
willing
do
to
this.
stand for when it mattered most.
You
And
knew what
beside
this
him,
meant to
Emma
me.
stood not as part of a plan, not as a solution,
I know,
but as
and
someone
I'm
who had
sorry.
changed everything simply by
I can't do this
being
anymore.
exactly who she was. And this time, there was
I
no
know.
expiration date, no condition waiting
I
at the
love
end,
you.
just a beginning that neither of them had expected,
sorry, I
but
shouldn't
both
have
of
done
them were
this.
finally ready to choose.